I'm going to give you the answer to the question I asked you, which was, what is strange about the timeline we're looking at? The timeline shows us the destruction of the temple, and then much of the story of Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar, the lions den, the writing on the wall, and then at the same moment, Zerubbabel returns to Jerusalem, right? And now Koresh, who has replaced Nebuchadnezzar really as the emperor of the world, allows the Jews to begin to build the temple.
There is some Jews there, yeah?
In fact, he finances it. Yeah. In fact, he finances it. And then, as you look at the timeline, you'll see about 6 years later, for some reason, we don't know why, by the timeline, the rebuilding is stopped. And then about 3 years after that, we see the Feast of Achashverosh. And the Purim story. And after the Purim story ends, and Purim is established, we see at the bottom right-hand corner, permission to resume the rebuilding. And soon after, Ezra returns, and the rebuilding of the Second Temple is completed. Nehemiah returns, and he builds the walls of Jerusalem. What we don't see in the story of the Megillah is what's going on in Jerusalem while the story of Purim is unfolding.
In Persia.
In Shushan. Right? And strangely enough, although it is part of, our Tanakh, it seems not to have much of an interest in Jerusalem.
In Jerusalem or Shushan?
In Jerusalem. It's all about Shushan. The story is really a Persian story. The Jews in Persia. Right? But there was great drama going on in Jerusalem at the same time. They started to build the temple, they stopped building the temple, they started building it again. Right? We don't have any sense of that in the Purim story. Right? So one of the questions asked is, not all stories in Torah are concerned with when they happened. Let me give you an example. Job. The story of Job, right, could really take place almost any time in our history. It's a personal story of an individual and his friends and the tragedies that befall him. The lessons are lessons of man's relationship with God and understanding of fate and all those kind of things. But it doesn't seem to have any historical context. Right? Could have happened virtually any time in our history. Right? But look how this story begins. Right? From the Megillah, the very first sentence, right? This, meaning the story we're about to say, took place in the days of Achashverosh. That Achashverosh who reigned over 127 provinces from Hodu to Cush. In those days when King Achashverosh sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was Shushan Habirah, Shushan the capital. Right? So clearly the author of this book, the Megillah Esther, right, is saying when this took place is critical. Critical to our understanding of the story itself. And we've talked about this before. The authors of the story, who we understand to be Esther and Mordecai, wrote the story at the same time that he was the prime minister and that she was the empress of Persia, still married to Achashverosh. Why don't we hear about the rest of the story? What's going on in Jerusalem? Right? This is a Jewish story. This is not Christian history. This is not Persian history. Right? This is part of our Tanakh, part of our canon. Right? And yet, something's missing.
It says where and it says when. Where it's in Shushan, because what's important for a story, where it was happening in Persia.
Right. So our theme is intersecting timelines. Right? There is another book that actually tells part of that story. Right? In order to have an appreciation of what's going on here, is we need to have actually a more solid understanding of what this means, the third year of the reign of Achashverosh. And in order to do that, we have to figure out who is Achashverosh. So that's our starting point today. Right? And maybe by understanding who is Achashverosh, we will begin to understand what the relationship was between Jerusalem and Shushan, and what the relationship between the Megillah and some of the hidden messages right at the beginning of the Megillah are. So that's what I want to look at today. Okay? So there are two theories about who is Achashverosh. Right? One theory, everybody accepts that he's one of a group of kings called the Achaemenid. Not the one you're thinking about, right? Achaemenid. They were really the most famous of the Persian kings. Xerxes, Darius.
It's like a family, or it's like a tsar's term?
I would say more like czars.
It's like an office.
The Persian emperor, right? So we understand that he was a king that he probably reigned somewhere around 539 to 330 BCE.
5?
Right.
539.
Yeah. This dynasty went on from 539 BCE to 330. It went on for over 200 years, right? 10 generation of kings, right? It began with Koresh, who defeated the Babylonians, defeated Nebuchadnezzar, and ended with Darius III. Right? This was approximately 3 years after the conquest of Persia by Alexander the Great. Right? So these kings reigned in Persia from the time of the defeat of Nebuchadnezzar to the time of the being eclipsed by the Macedonian Empire of Alexander the Great. During that time, Persia was the great empire. I think I've shown you, everybody has a copy of the empire from Hodu to Kush, from India, as you can see, the Indus River on the far right, all the way to Kush, which is south of the southern part of India, Libya. It takes in all of Assyria, the Babylonian Empire. It absorbed a huge area of the world. And this went on for a bit over 200 years. Yeah. During that time, Achashverosh reigned. That's our understanding, right? But which one of those emperors was Achashverosh? Right? So there's two views. There's more than two views, but there's two that are considered to be popular ones, and these really do impact our story. I'm not just interested simply in Persian history, but its relationship. From 404 BC to 359, so that's around 45 years, right? There was an emperor called Artaxerxes, right? Who most people hold was the son of Xerxes, Artaxerxes II, right? And Josephus identifies him as Achashverosh in his work Antiquities, volume 11. But an earlier and more widely accepted...
Sorry, are you giving which numbers? Yeah. 340, you're talking about
340 BCE.
3003, or it's number underneath?
No, the number underneath.
340, here is 340. Here is 340.
304, or it's 340 here.
340 here.
We're looking at the red numbers.
Red numbers?
You can see...
340.
Well, look at where the story is. Look at where our story is, and then look down.
340.
And you'll see.
Yeah.
Okay? Okay, you got it?
Yeah, from 340 to 3...
Yeah.
From 280...
Right.
Whatever, to here, yeah? This
From
is the
340 till...
Оно уменьшается.
Я знаю. Till
Zero is the beginning of our common era, is the phrase
it's
that's
here.
commonly used,
It's
right?
here, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, here is the story.
You're at the Purim story?
Yeah, from here.
Actually, Purim story is 3-6.
Persia rose to power before the Purim story and continued for a while after. Okay. So there's another theory, right? An earlier, more widely accepted one that identifies Achashverosh as Xerxes. Xerxes was a great Persian emperor, right? And he ruled from 486 BCE to 465, 20 years, right?
486.
Yeah.
Say it again, from
86
to 465.
480. Here, from 486 to where?
To 465. As the numbers go down, you come closer to our common era, right?
But very short period of time.
20 years.
20 years, okay.
20 years.
But it's happened before the...
It was before destruction.
Before before the story.
And it was before the
So,
It was before the story.
you'd
of
have to
Esther.
shift the story down, right? That version has it with Artaxerxes, right?
Do we
Our
have a
story
different
has
times
Xerxes.
or it's a historically very set time of Purim?
No, we have it based on the reign of Achashverosh. Right? That's the problem, right? In the third year of the reign of Achashverosh, Achashverosh, we know, came after Koresh, and who came after Belshazzar, who followed Nebuchadnezzar.
It's based on
Right.
Jewish history, on our keeping of history, or the Tanakh has a timeline?
Tanakh has a timeline. Well, we're dealing with this now. We're trying to figure out what it is. Right? Tanakh tells us that the Megillah specifically, right, refers to Vashti as being the granddaughter of Belshazzar, right, who was the emperor after Nebuchadnezzar. He was the emperor before Koresh conquered Babylon, right? And Koresh seems to have been replaced by Achashverosh. So it looks like there's 4 emperors, right? There was Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian. He was followed by Belshazzar, right?
And the date of destruction of the temple
we
is
don't. The date of the destruction of the temple is separate from. The date of the destruction of the temple is a pretty
Set
solid
up.
date,
Okay.
and it's also done by Nebuchadnezzar. Right? But after that, there are a number of issues, right? But let's just go forward for a second, right?
Okay.
I have a question.
Yeah.
You send us with the dates to here, but I see the names of those kings here. It means that they were kings here in this area, no?
Okay, it's very hard for me to see that thing at this.
See, it has 4, like if it's
What numbers
like
do you
something-
see when you go all the way down?
440.
440 for
Okay,
Xerxes,
let's
right? That's
see.
what we said, I think.
Let's see,
Just here,
Nebuchadnezzar. It's
486 to 465 we have for Xerxes, and 404 to 459 for Artaxerxes.
You see, it's here and here.
For now, don't get hung up on the exact dates. Let's just move on for a second, right? Okay? Right? Because the whole thing might shift down. Right? That's a question, right? From that timeline, right? There are many different timelines, right?
Who is evil Mordor?
He was I think, Median emperor as well. It was in the middle of the changeover from Babylon to Persia.
Isn't God?
What?
Wasn't the Persian God? Babylonian? Marduk?
That is the name of the deity. You're right. But let's just go on for a second, because we're just going to try to establish what was the other name for Achashverosh, the one that history has for him, as was Jewish history. So, many people hold, including Herodotus, the Greek historian who traveled the world, that Xerxes was likely to be our Achashverosh, right? And he speaks of Xerxes as a king who was overcome by women, wine. He enjoyed parties big time, and that he had, says Herodotus, that Xerxes had built a absolutely magnificent palace in Shushan. So one thinks, that's a clue that Xerxes may be our guy, right? Okay. In the Babylonian city of Sifar, an administrative record was discovered not so long ago, noting that during the period of this king, Xerxes, there was a senior official from the city of Shushan who served as the royal treasurer by the name of Mordecai. Mordecai. The name is highly reminiscent of Mordecai the Jew. Finally, the only other reference, biblical reference outside of Esther to Haman's decree is Ezra. Now, Ezra is our hint to what was going on in the rest of the world. Says Ezra, excuse me for it's a very small print. Okay. Says Ezra, the people of the land then weakened the hands of the people of Yehuda and frightened them from the building. They hired advisors against them to disrupt their plans all the days of Cyrus the king of Persia until the reign of Darius of Persia. During the reign of Achashverosh, this says Ezra, right? At the beginning of his reign, they wrote a calumny, a hostile letter, against the inhabitants of Judea and Jerusalem.
A calumny?
A calumny is a document that says very, very negative...
Danos.
Denunciation. Denunciation, actually. It's probably the same word, actually. Against the Jews. And part of this denunciation was to write to the emperor, lest you think you're just being, freedom of religion oriented, you should know what the Jews are up to. It's not that they want to build a temple. What they want to do is they want to build a their intention to build the walls of Jerusalem again and rebel against you. Right? And if you look again at the map, you'll notice that the empire of Persia includes parts of Judah, Yehuda, most of Samaria and Jerusalem, right? But the Arab, what is Arabia, was not part of that empire, right? At all. So there was room for them to be concerned in the Persian that maybe they're going to ally and separate.
Was Arabia empty or it was filled with something?
It was Bedouin, right? And by the way, Jews. The cities of Mecca and Medina had many Jews in it at the time.
They already existed?
What? I think so, yeah. We'll have to check on the timelines, but I think so, yeah. So this now we have a medrash that this calumny, this denunciation of the Jews building the temple, was actually written by one of Haman's sons. That he wrote to his father, and it was passed on to Achashverosh, that the Jews are up to no good here, and you should stop them.
Or it has
it's a medrash. It's a medrash. Right? It's not actually in the Megillah. Right? Now Ezra tells us not that it's Haman's son, but he says such a document was written. We just read it, right? That there was a document written, and that after that the building was stopped. Right. Okay, so the next reason here is finally the other biblical reference outside of Esther to Haman's decree is in Ezra, would seem to identify Achashverosh as Xerxes. The people of the land would weaken the hands of the people of Judea. It repeats it and frightens them off from building. Right, so people in the province of Yehuda that were not Jews were constantly attacking and fighting with the Jews who were left still in the land of Israel, trying to prevent them from fulfilling the promise of rebuilding the temple, which Koresh had instigated, and Zerubbabel had gone back to do.
Koresh
right?
first one.
Koresh, along with Zerubbabel, began the building of the temple. Right? Koresh said, "There's a."
Who was Zerubbabel?
What? Zerubbabel was a Jew who was the first, in a sense, governor under Koresh of. He returned to start the building. In fact, so if indeed Achashverosh is Xerxes, then we have an orderly account of the beginning of the dynasty. Koresh, Darius, Xerxes, who is Achashverosh, followed by Artaxerxes. Right. If Achashverosh is indeed Xerxes, the narrative continues about 100 years after the destruction of the first temple, more importantly, about 30 years after the dedication of the altar of the second temple. So what happened, let's remember what this meant was, right, that Koresh said, go ahead and build a temple. Zerubbabel went back with a number of people, and there were people there, and they began the process, right? They built the Mizbeach. They built the Mizbeach, right? Not the whole temple, but they built the Mizbeach. They were getting ready to perform sacrifices, right? And they were in the process of it. They dedicated it, right? And our story.
They dedicated the temple?
No, the Mizbeach. And our story happens roughly 30 years after Zerubbabel had begun the process. Right? And
Our story means Esther's
but it
story.
came to a halt. Yeah, our story meaning the Megillah. Right? So this means, and you need to pause and think about this because it may bring other things to mind. Right? This means that Israel, which was in very poor condition, with impoverished people, Jews living there, what was left of the Jewish population, right? But in Babylon, the Jews were flourishing, right? And then later in Persia, even more so. I mean, you read the beginning of the story. They had a special feast for the Jewish population at the end, for the people of Shushan, right? And the Jews were there, and they were honored people, and they were mingling. Mordechai
and command description is quite...
Mordechai was a member of the court, right? He had access to the emperor, right? So we're talking about Jews who were prospering, And in Shushan, one of the reasons given that they wanted to go to the party was an opportunity to do some business. The capital has moved here. They're going to be building roads, post offices, different things, right? Let's get some of the action here. We'll go to the party. We'll schmooze. We'll get some contracts as part of it. This is not my idea. This is other people's idea. It's part of the reason they wanted to do it, right? What?
No, and they were actually people who can. Why they were there? Why they said so Shushan was there because it was a community of artisans.
Yeah, artisans, but also there was a lot of Jews. It was a very Jewish city.
Who are Jews?
Right? Yeah. So, try to have this in mind for a second, right? Jerusalem is a tragic city. We know how Yirmiyahu describes it in Eicha, the pain of Jerusalem, the tears of Jerusalem, the suffering of the once magnificent city that, has fallen on bad times. And he uses many metaphors for it, right? And the Jews who were left there were a terribly impoverished, sad group of people, right? The majority of Jews in the world were in the diaspora. They were in Golis. And they were prospering. Among those was Mordechai's family, who had come from Israel to exile, and now were prospering in exile. Zerubbabel picks up and says, we got to start building again. So you can imagine the Jewish population said, yes, let's make Aliyah. And they all left their beautiful homes and gardens and their fenced-in places and rushed back to Israel to rebuild the temple. Not really.
Of course not.
It seems that they all stayed in Babylon, with very few exceptions. Among those are the heroes of our story, Mordecai and Esther, right?
Mm-hmm.
It should give you pause for a second.
Maybe Persian king wouldn't let mass exodus of people.
Koresh said anybody who wants to go is welcome to go, right? And we're going to help them. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Anybody could have left. Absolutely anybody could have left at that
No,
point.
people left. The lowest of the lowest. Like
Yeah.
Mamzerim.
With Ezra.
Like Mamzerim, like...
No, it was
thieves.
Zerubbabel first.
Uh-huh.
First,
Those people, they left. But the
and the
elite,
people who were left behind were also that as well, right? Wasn't a good situation. I mean, we'll come back later on in our story to Ezra and Nehemiah, what they saw when they went back. It was, people were much more frum in the diaspora than they were in Jerusalem.
Yeah, Haman described them as a mitzvah.
Obviously, they didn't work on Shabbos
They didn't work for Shabbos
in
and
Babylon,
ate kosher
right?
and didn't drink
Yeah,
wine with the
that's right.
goyim.
So it seems that they were very, very frum, but not very interested in the land of Israel. Right? And it's not as though there was nothing going on there. So this is one of the points I want to make, is that at the same time our story is going on in the palace, right? What's going on is the people in the land of Israel are struggling very painfully, struggling to eat, struggling to stay warm in the winter, right? Struggling to rebuild the temple, right? And around them are people that are constantly attacking them, trying to prevent them from accomplishing this, with a great deal of success, actually. Great deal of success. So where are our heroes, helping in this thing, right? And what do they have to say about it? It would seem in the Megillah, nothing. Virtually nothing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, not so much. There are things in the Megillah. Right? There's the very famous medrash that we all know, that when Achashverosh is promising things to Esther, he always says half the kingdom, until the very end when he gives her everything she wants. Right? And we understand half the kingdom, if we look at our map, somehow from Shushan to Jerusalem, I guess they're saying up to that point, right? Now, by the way, that seems to be not half the kingdom when you look at the map at all.
Mm-hmm.
But
no, Shushan kind of in the middle.
The Medrash tells us that he was promising her everything up to Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But Jerusalem you're not going to get. Right? Up to that point you will get.
Mm-hmm.
But we understand that's a hidden message about Jerusalem itself in the Megillah. But now I want to read you something from the 5th verse.
The question is, why he doesn't want to give her Jerusalem?
He doesn't know that she's Jewish.
Exactly.
Yeah, at that point he doesn't know.
So
Maybe it's because Jerusalem is important. Let's look at a very interesting verse. In the description of the party, that it's very opulent, right? The description of the palace and the party, right? It's one of the things we all remember, that the wine flowed like a river, everybody could drink whatever they wanted. But let's look at the words. I'm going to read the English, but there's one or two words that are very important here. And then these days were complete. The king made a banquet for 7 days. Right? This is after the first part. Right? This is the one for the people found in Shushan, the capital, great and small alike, in the courtyard of the king's palace. With white and green and techelos hangings, blue hangings, right? Embroidered with cords of linen and argamon, purple wool, on kesef, on silver rods and marble columns, couches of gold and silver, on a floor of alabaster and marble, in rows and circles. Drinks were served in golden vessels, each of the vessels differing from all the other vessels. The royal wine was in abundance according to the king's means, but the drinking rule was not enforced, for this is what the king had established with all the many staff of his house, to comply with each man's will. So you didn't have to drink if you didn't want to. You could drink as much as you wanted to. So if you look carefully, there are many references to the temple in this. They're talking about a courtyard, they're talking about within the courtyard, they're talking about colors of argamon and techelis, they're talking about silver, they're talking about golden vessels, right? And the author is making a dual reference. It's a pun at this point, really. But not a funny kind of pun, a tragic pun, saying that the temple, which had the same elements, same materials, right, was a very holy place. And we all know that it was a place that involved piety, that the use of wine had very specific purposes, that the different colors and gold and silver, each one of them had tremendous significance within the temple, and that here it was all abandoned. It was all given over to animal appetites, and that there were no controls at all. The king took pride, this king, right? This king, meaning Achashverosh, took pride in destroying any disciplines and control, right? He wanted people to be, in a sense, out of control, but indebted to him, right? The king of the inner courtyards of the temple, right, was quite different, right? He had very specific rules in which appetites at some times were satisfied and that appetites were controlled at other times. That the lust for gold, silver, wine, and everything that goes with it, everything had to be in its place, and lust was not the value, the chief value. Of course, the author of the Megillah, again, has to tread very, very lightly in this story. So, if you think again about the audience, and it's something to think about all the time, right? The references that are being made right now are references everybody understood. That is to say, if you were to say that the leader of Canada had created an Oval Office for himself, right? That would tell you very quickly that
trying to look like America.
That there's some connection to the U.S. president, the Oval Office, right? You know, when you hear these terms, these materials used this way, inner courtyard, the fabrics, the materials, right? The king, right? Everybody understood who read this document, except Achashverosh, who thought he was reading it on a surface level. Everybody understood, you know, we're actually talking about Jerusalem. Now here's the kicker. Here's the kicker, and I want you to think about this, right? Is we rarely say the word Shushan. We always say Shushan. What?
Bira. Shushan
Bira, right? Which means
capital city.
The capital city, right? Daniel refers to the capital as Bira, right? There's one other use of this term, right? It's in Chronicles. And we see something very similar to it in the Haftarah Vayechi, the Book of Chronicles, Book 2 of Chronicles, right? In Chronicles, right? Chronicles really has mostly to do with the kings, right? And in the Haftarah at the death of Yaakov, Vayechi, right? The Haftarah is the death of David. And David HaMelech gives detailed instructions to his son Shlomo. And he begins by saying, if you walk in God's ways and fulfill the covenant, keep the mitzvahs, right, that you'll have a long and successful reign. And then he goes on with a list of things that he wants his son to do to settle some unsettled scores and to be kind to some people who should be kind. And he gives him really a list of what to do. Right? But there's very close parallel to the first paragraph of that Haftorah in the Divrei Hayamim, the Chronicles of the Days, right? The words of the days, Divrei, which we translate as Chronicles in English. And he says in here,
Who prints books like this?
Okay, in here he says, also, grant to Shlomo, my son, a perfect heart, to keep your commandments, your testimonies, and your statutes, to carry out everything, and to build the Bira, the capital, for which I have prepared. So it seems that there's only one other city called Bira, right, in Tanakh. Right?
They don't use this word regularly talking about any...
One city. It doesn't mean city, right? It means capital, right? So there's one other capital, right? There's Shushan Habira and there's Yerushalayim Habira. Right? So when we hear the word Bira, right, meaning capital, we should know, just as we learn, one of the things we learn about the Megillah is God is not mentioned in the Megillah, right? And it has unique halachas because of it. We know that if a person, heaven forbid, drops the Torah, community is expected to fast as a result of it, right? It's not true with a Megillah.
For a different reason.
Right? No, it's because the name of God is not written on the Megillah.
Because everybody drank on Purim and probably
it's not the reason.
On regular
the reason
basis,
is specifically the reason is specifically the name of God is not mentioned in it. Right? And it has many other halachas that are different from most of the other books of Tanakh because of that. And yet, everybody who has learned about the Megillah, in their first study of it for Purim, knows what about the name of God.
Melech.
Right.
Melech.
That's it. So whenever we see the word Melech by itself, we understand that's a reference to God. When we see the word Melech Achashverosh, right, or Achashverosh HaMelech, right, at that point we say, no, that's a reference to specifically the Emperor of Persia at the time, right? Which means that God is actually mentioned, but in a code way. Right? So it is with Yerushalayim, right? References to Bira, right? Were understood by the people of the time to mean a reference both to ourselves and to our countrymen, who are in Jerusalem as well. Right?
Damascus is not a Bira.
Not referred to in Tanakh as Bira. Right? I mean, I don't know, it was Rome, Bira, not in, it wasn't part of
Is there
Tanakh,
any other word
right?
for capital? Is Ottawa Bira of Canada in modern language?
You mean in Hebrew? Like modern Hebrew? Yeah, I would think so, right? Yeah. So what we see here, right, is that there is an underlying theme that is part of our story. And we're going to enlarge on it as we go further, but what we see is that within the Megillah there is a great deal below the surface. And of course it had to remain below the surface. It's not just a cute textual game that the authors are playing. The authors are saying to us something quite simple. Right? That is, my audience, the Megillah was the news of the day, in a sense, right? You opened up the newspaper, right, and you saw Haman defeated, Mordechai promoted to prime minister, right? Esther's still in the palace, right? We're okay. We, the Jews here in Persia, we're okay, right? Esther's son is going to be the next emperor, right? So when they're reading the Megillah, we're looking back, 1,000 some odd years, whatever, back to this story saying that that's history. That's not what the Megillah was. The Megillah was a letter that was written to the Jewish people of the time that year and distributed to them that year. And Purim became a holiday that year, unlike Hanukkah. Remember?
Mm-hmm.
Hanukkah, they waited till the next year to say, maybe yes, maybe no. Okay, we're going with it. Purim, they recognized right away. And this document that we read as a look back at a miracle that happened over 13 years that was in Purim, we look at it as a piece of history. They didn't when they were reading the Megillah. It was not a historical document. It was the morning paper, the morning newspaper. That's what they were seeing. Now we know the inside story of what happened. Right? But since it was what they call today a tell-all book about the Oval Office, right, and the Lincoln bedroom, it was also had to be written very carefully. You know, if Obama's wife decides, what's her first name? Michelle.
Michael.
Right. Michelle Obama. If she were to write a book while he's still in office, right, she would have to write it very, very, very carefully. But imagine instead if Obama was unhappy with his first wife and in a drunken stupor had her killed. Right? How much more carefully Michelle would have to be about writing her book. This was the position Esther found herself in when writing with the Prime Minister the news of the day for the people to see.
By the way, they call it Megillah Esther. They didn't call it Megillah somebody else.
That's right. That's
she
right.
had her name attached to it.
So, you know, and we know Esther hidden, right, as well. There's many clues to this, but
So
there's
I don't see what is the connection between Shushan Bira and Jerusalem Bira.
So what I'm saying is, and we're going to see more of this as we go forward.
It's like German and
but
before Second War they say that Berlin is the second Jerusalem.
You know, it's easy to look at the German Jews and say that, right? But we say it here today. You know?
I don't think we say it.
No,
we stopped saying it, by the way, in the last 10 years. But you know, New York was the capital of Yiddishkeit for a long time, right?
The
Golden Medina,
the country, this of Hesed, Malchut of Hesed.
right? And America was called the Golden Medina at the end, right? The golden nation for Jews, right?
And then, but before it was, they call it the Trefe Medina, the country of Treif.
Also, that's true. But in the last, 40, 50 years, right, Israel has taken on a different meaning to Jews than it did for a very, very long time. Right? And of course, today, Jews outside of Israel are more and more insecure every day. Every day. But for a very long time, we in the diaspora were the rich, comfortable, safe Jews after the war, right? And the people in Israel were the idealists who were kind of struggling and certainly not the cream of the crop. We see great exceptions to this, but it wasn't like where outstanding people went, Jews went, at the turn of the century.
You know what I did? You were going to take it off. You know what I did?
Okay, so let me just finish. So what we'll be doing as we go forward is to look at these parallels more carefully. Ezra is a clue to this, because although he wasn't part of Zerubbabel, he writes about, the history of the...
And he kind of could have lived in this time.
He did live in this time.
He was alive.
Yeah, he
but
did
he
live in
wasn't
this time.
there.
Yeah. So,
but he didn't live.
So we're going to see some of those parallels of what was going on in Jerusalem and Israel at the same time that the Purim story was unfolding.